Good afternoon and welcome to today's McGill Alumni Webcast, the second in our four-part series in partnership with the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative, looking at the environmental, social, and economic challenges facing our planet and the role that McGill researchers, students, and administrators are playing to help us understand the issues and develop more sustainable approaches and practices. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Thursday, September 17th. Today, as the world remains justifiably preoccupied with COVID-19, we examine whether the rapid global response to the pandemic might inform or perhaps even force us to rethink how we approach issues around sustainability. Can the renewed focus on research collaborations across disciplines and regions that have emerged in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak be replicated in the fight for a more sustainable world? Has this public health challenge been powerful enough to demonstrate how connected we all are to each other and to the plants and animals with whom we share this planet? Or might the society that emerges from the pandemic be so exhausted of self-sacrificing for the greater good that we might in fact be setting the clock back on meaningful change in support of sustainability? Tough questions for our panel today, but I think they're up to the task of providing us with some meaningful answers, maybe even a few more questions with which the world must wrestle. So without further ado, let's meet the panel. We have with us today Catherine Potvin, who's a professor in the Department of Biology, the Canada Research Chair on Climate Change Mitigation and Tropical Forests, and director of McGill's Panama Field Studies semester, which sends students to Panama for up to 4 months to explore Latin American social and environmental issues up close. Welcome, Professor Potvin.
A pleasure.
We have with us as well Sébastien Jaudoin, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law and the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and the Environment. His research focuses on the relationship between human rights and climate change, transnational and comparative climate law and governance, and the role of disability rights in addressing environmental and health challenges. Welcome, Professor Jaudoin. And finally, Cassandra Naranjan, who's a Bachelor of Civil Law and JD Juris Doctor candidate at McGill's Faculty of Law, as well as an outspoken intersectional feminist researcher and advocate on issues related to the rights of women, girls, and other underrepresented groups. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for taking time out of your schedules to spend some time with us today. I'm really excited to tackle some of the questions that I set forth in the introduction. Before we jump into the conversation, just a reminder that if you are watching live and you have questions for our panelists, you can send them in to us via email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests. So before we dive too deeply into today's topic, let's find out a little bit more about each of our panelists and their backgrounds. Professor Potvin, maybe I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your teaching and research focus at McGill, and in particular, the fascinating Panama Field Studies semester, and how this experience abroad aims to expose McGill students to some of the key issues around sustainability, environmentalism, and globalization?
So my research and my students, my lab in general, we're interested in two important environmental problems: climate change and loss of biodiversity. But we're really looking at it from a solution viewpoint. So we're trying to find ways forward for humanity in tackling those issues, ways that are taking a solidarity and an ethics and a community engagement at the heart of them. And it's the same sort of teaching that I do in Panama. So I'm teaching a course in tropical ecology. I'm bringing students in contact with a variety of different ecosystems. But we also drive home the fact that this planet, this beautiful planet, we have to care for it, but we will not care for it if we don't care for the people that live on it. So for me, and caring for the environment and for the people that live in these environments is as important. So that's the equation on which my teaching and my research evolves.
Sounds very interesting. I'm sure you'll have a lot of great insight to share in our conversation today based on those experiences. Professor Jaudoin, as a law professor and scholar in the areas of governance and public policy, can you share with us what drives your research and how it intersects with the big questions around sustainability?
Right. So I'm really interested in the human dimensions of sustainability and specifically human rights-based approaches to sustainability. So in this context, one of the things that interests me is how human rights can be leveraged, can be used to guide the adoption and implementation of public policies and solutions to environmental problems, but also how we can design environmental solutions to big problems like climate change in ways that respect the rights of different groups in society, and not actually have the unintended or sometimes intended consequence of violating those rights. So ideally, I'm interested in studying how we can develop more equitable, as well as how that equity, so more equitable environmental policies and solutions, and as well how that equity can then also contribute to the effectiveness of solving environmental and social problems.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update on your background and expertise. And so let me turn to Cassandra now. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I know when we were planning this particular webcast, we thought it'd be important to include some younger and perhaps student voices to the conversation. So I'm thrilled you're able to join us. So I'm curious, how did you first get interested in issues of sustainability and social equity? And as someone who's at the very beginning of what looks to be a solve in your lifetime?
I didn't catch the tail end of that, but I'll just jump into my background. So my interests in social equity were very much born of my life experience as a young woman of color, and particularly in high school, I very much struggled with the idea of representation because so much of my adolescence was shaped by my truth as a model minority in a predominantly white school, where a brand of feminism was espoused for me to subscribe to that was inherently exclusive. So my natural instinct was to further involve myself in school through leadership opportunities and to educate myself on topics I felt like I wasn't learning about, specifically, non-Eurocentric history. And as I learned more about intersectional feminist theories and critiques and readings, I grew a strong passion for gender justice and global affairs, which I pursued in my undergrad at the University of Toronto, pursued research projects in it, also engaged in a lot of advocacy and public speaking in local, national, and international venues. But it was only through further educating myself, I would say, that I started to realize the inherent links between feminism, women's issues, but also climate change and sustainability, because in the global South especially, women are incredibly tied to their environments. There is a reliance on agriculture, traditional knowledge systems to adapt to climate change. The intersection of poverty and climate change is incredibly explicit in these arenas. Or even beyond that, like stateless migrants are more likely to be women. That might be as a result of climate change-induced conflict or environmental disasters. So I also was able to learn more about that with Professor Jodoin this summer, working for him in his research lab. So to not learn about climate change and sustainability and the role of women does a disservice to those communities. So I'm continuing to learn about that and continuing to advocate on these issues.
Okay, interesting. So just another question for you, Cassandra. For those in the audience who maybe aren't familiar with the term intersectional feminism, can you explain a little bit more about what that means and how does it shape your worldview and your approach to problem solving?
Yeah, absolutely. So intersectional feminism is a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. If we think about feminism and how it's been produced throughout history in its first and second wave conceptions, we saw it very much as asking society to consider the wants, needs, and rights of cisgender, white, able-bodied, upper and middle class women. Intersectional feminism was very much an act of resistance and created by Black womanism and scholarship to address the concurrent layers of oppression that Black women specifically faced as a result of their intersecting identities of their racial identity, their class status, their disability or ability, and so on and so forth. And presently, because of this, cornerstone foundation of gender studies that we have now, we're able to apply that theory to people of all different races, classes, ethnicities, etc. But in seeing those multiple layers of inequality, oppression, and marginalization, it allows us to nuance our ability to solve problems by asking, who have we harmed? Who have we dismissed? Who have we forgotten in society? And in asking who, we inevitably ask why. And that's where patterns of structural violence, patriarchy, colonialism, ableism start to emerge. And we're able to find patterns of inequality and address them in that way. But I think something that is important to be said is that intersectional feminism is often misapplied. We often jump to gender mainstreaming which is another theory that attempts to, in problem solving, consider gender at every level of problem solving. So for example, in a pandemic, you would consider gender in health, in the workplace, in the economy, in the domestic sphere. But intersectional feminism begs the question, but what about Black women in these spaces? What about disabled women in these spaces? Instead of applying it to different spheres, we're asking the layers of oppression that women, trans, non-binary folk might face in those spaces again. So again, it's nuancing our understandings to fully catch all the gaps and all the people that are often dismissed in society. So it's truly an inclusive theory.
Great. Well, thanks for that explanation. Very helpful, and I think will help frame some of the conversation today. So let me revisit the question that was at the heart of today's webcast, which is, will the response to COVID-19 change the way we approach sustainability? And there are, of course, so many ways to approach this question because there have been so many responses to the pandemic that we can try to address. But let me begin with you, Professor Potvin, as the resident biologist on today's panel, with a question that many have been asking since the beginning of this pandemic. So maybe I'll try to frame it. So there's certainly a line of thinking among some people that the COVID-19 pandemic, which is believed to have been triggered by a single virus jumping to humans from an animal host, really underscores the fine balance that exists between humans and animals, and that as humans continue to encroach into previously uninhabited areas and come into contact with new species of plants and animals, we're at an increased risk of unleashing even more viruses and pandemics. So I guess my question to you is there any biological evidence of this, and do you give this theory any credence?
So after we first spoke, I did a literature search on that, and there's in fact very little evidence for this. The evidence, a few scholars have argued that as forest is being fragmented, people are brought in contact with animals. Again, there's not a lot of evidence for me to tell you this is true or this is not true. So I'll more tell you where I stand now on my own thoughts after reading the literature. So I believe that humans and animals in hunter-gatherer society have always been in touch one with each other. Okay, so it's not because of forest fragmentation that suddenly humans encounter wild animals. I mean, I spend a lot of time in indigenous community where all the meat comes from hunting. So I think maybe what's missing on the scholarly literature is a reflection on the density of human population. So what has happened in China really is an encounter probably between bats, pangolin, and human. Because genetic studies show that there are two animals that had that virus, and the virus, yes, did jump on human, but it did jump on human in a very, very dense place where there's many, many human in a market. So maybe the issue is not so much the more frequent encounter, but the urban setting and the dense setting. So I think if we look at the pandemic, at least for the first spread of it, it spreaded where there are many, many people. So what I'm trying to say is probably viruses have always jumped on human hosts because there's always been, ever since humans have been eating animals, there's always been these encounters. But when you have many humans together, if there's a virus that jumps on one human, then it begins to jump on other humans, which did not happen if you had virus jumping from one animal to a human, but that human did not have many people around him. So I think human density and the part of sustainability that has to do with world population is probably at the heart of what we're seeing.
Okay, great. And we do have a question from a viewer that I'll get to later on, which I think gets to some of those issues around, how much population can the planet sustain without us running into these issues over and over. But let me sort of turn it back to our law representatives, Professor Jourdain and Cassandra. So as I mentioned earlier, the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been quite varied. We've seen some incredible collaborations happening in the research world. We've seen governments scrambling to enact and enforce a wide range of policies and laws in service of public health. And of course, ordinary citizens just trying to stay safe, cope with a world that has suddenly been turned upside down. So maybe I'll start with you, Professor Jourdain. I'm curious, amongst all these reactions, what has stood out for you that might be useful for us in this pandemic as we turn to address some of the issues associated with building a more sustainable planet?
Mhm. Well, I think it's first of all, I think we should start by saying that normally what happens in the crisis is there's an innovative response, and there's lots of research showing that people are more willing to abandon their beliefs about what should be done. And so the classic example is the economic depression in the 1930s, where previously economists, governments, policymakers were of the view that governments shouldn't play that huge of a role in the economy. And then that is reversed, and we end up with the welfare state. Another example is World War II. All of these men are sent overseas, and so you have women that go into factories, and what happens is a massive increase in the participation of women in the labor force out of World War II. Right, so it's a bit early to tell what are the sort of lasting things that will come out of this. There's some initial things, and I also want to say that some of the most powerful ones are probably the ones that are reinforcing existing trends. So the first I'll mention is teleworking. At some point, with a vaccine and with further efforts to control and eradicate the disease, I have no doubt that we will see more people returning to the offices that they used to work in previously downtown. But it's certainly the case that there won't be as many as before. And so whatever that number is, right, there's definitely an increase. And so we're going to see increases in teleworking. Why is this? Well, it's a good thing because it's better for people to be able to work from home, and they want to live in neighborhoods that are neighborhoods where they can meet all of their other needs. So there is like this trend in urban policy right now towards what's called urban densification. And there's also another concept called the walkability score. So it's how easy is it for you from your house to walk to a restaurant, do your groceries, right? So if you don't have people commuting 5 times a week in their cars, but maybe they go in once a week, or maybe they work remotely most of the time, you will see densification of all kinds. And so that could be really good in terms of not only reducing the number of cars that are driven on the road every day, but also really good for people who have dependent care responsibilities to not have to travel. People with disabilities, it's long been a demand of the disability community to be able to work or study from home. So these are things that I think we should be, for those of us who care about these things, we should try to build on these gains, right? In the previous sort of era, if you were someone who wanted to work from home for whatever reason, you might have been told, no, impossible, can't do it. I know even at McGill that there were meetings where, no, there's no way that can happen. And then in the 2-week period, it all happened. And so the question is, of course, there's a technology that's been acquired, there's the know-how, and I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us to try to build on those gains. So that's one example of a lesson. Maybe another one would be there's been support for developing basic minimum income policies, right? So these are policies that they have different types of definitions, but in general, what they do is they ensure that everyone has a basic minimum income, that they can meet their needs. And the idea here is that this is more equitable, but also more efficient, because you reduce the need to have people falling under different types of income support programs. Well, the federal government's CERB that they developed here in response to the pandemic, it looks like a basic minimum income, right? It was pretty high. It was available to everyone, and then later it would be clawed back if you had worked. And what it's done is it's generated a lot of data, and data that actually tells us if people could work, were they disincentivized from working or not. And so far, the results tell us no. And so, in fact, I will see what the throne from the speech from the throne announces later this week. But I think that there's been basically a massive experimentation with basic minimum income around the world, and hopefully we can learn from that and design the types of policies that can be helpful in the future.
Right. Sounds interesting. So Cassandra, maybe I'll turn it over to you to get some thoughts on that. When you're sort of looking at it, obviously from your lens, and you see sort of all of the disruption caused by the pandemic, do you also see glimmers of hope and sort of innovative approaches that could be applied to our future lives after the vaccine has been developed and then we start to tackle some of the broader sustainability challenges?
For sure. I mean, I really want to unpack further the idea of the basic minimum income as a key innovation. And I think when we look at it from an equity lens, for example, it takes a whole other life, especially, and we can tie it back to the environment. So, if we're looking at essential frontline precarious work that's happening in the pandemic, it's quite gendered. We see nurses, teachers, wait staff, even the nonprofit sector that is attempting to help these people is often very feminized. We also know that women have borne the brunt of the shadow pandemic, which is a really important term, contested in terms of its terminology, but essentially talks about the heightened understanding of gender-based violence during this time, as many women and other folks are isolated within their homes with abusers, which can be incredibly violent, fatal, as we saw in Nova Scotia earlier this summer. And so a lot of times in these situations, there's a lot of financial dependence upon the abuser. And so when we're thinking about, poor women, young women, racialized women working on the front lines, people who are confined to their homes, universal basic income, as it kind of seems de facto through CERB, is incredibly important, and especially for moving forward. And it prompts us to have dialogues around the gender pay gap, which is also exacerbated along racialized lines, where Black women in Canada make 59 cents for every dollar that a non-racialized man does. It allows us to also look at unpaid care work that women conduct, which has also been much more visible now that we're all at home. We're seeing women have struggled with going back to work when they have so much care work to cater to also have to, parenting roles are also very much gendered. A lot of women have slowly started to explain that they're staying home to teach their children because of education gaps that are currently happening as a result of the pandemic. Universal basic income has been espoused for decades. We saw it with Midcome in Manitoba. We saw it with pilot programs in BC and Ontario, and they have had strong results and truly do have very equitable responses for the lives of everyday people. They definitely need to be conducted concurrently with other social programs. But even if we look at it in terms of agency in addressing climate change, like, it is a privilege. It is expensive to be able to attend protests, to attend rallies, like from commuting to finding childcare. It's expensive. Being eco-friendly, being vegan, being environmentally conscious does come at a price tag for many people. Having basic income, having access to resources, not only allows people to start, with basic survival, but allows them to engage in agency and autonomy to be able to make decisions that help their society, that help themselves as well. So when we think about basic income, I think like the government has really set a precedent for saying that an adult in Canada needs $2,000 when they definitely aren't able to make that in their workplaces often. So I think this is actually quite important and something that needs to be addressed further.
Great. Well, thanks for that great insight. Professor Potvin, maybe I'll turn it over to you now, and maybe I can ask you to put on your international lens for a minute as you would tackle this question. I think some of the issues that were just brought up by Cassandra and by Professor Jourdain before that, things like minimum income or office workers not having to telecommute or not having to commute so they could work from home more, seems to be very kind of Canadian or Western issues or challenges. But what about in the rest of the world? What about in developing nations like Panama and other places that you might be familiar with? I mean, the pandemic has obviously impacted them in a very different way. Where do you see the future of sort of sustainability? How does it emerge in these sort of settings where the concerns are not about, traffic on the way to work?
Well, so for me, I suppose the pandemic has probably increased my concern. First, I think that, we've worked, and this is a good example today, we moved into this web world. But most people in Panama don't have access to internet or a computer. So de facto, it seems to me that the cleavage in the world is increasing. So all of the climate change negotiation internationally, there were always two sides. You know, there was the quote developed world, who, by the way, is the one that has caused the problem in the emission and is still causing the problem, is saying, oh, we need to reduce and we need to act. And then the developing, quote, I don't like that word, you know, southern nations saying, well, we need to develop. We have a right to improve livelihoods. So there's always been that tension. And I think it's paramounting now, because in the communities where we work, basically they don't have internet. So we're now trying to have internet installed for them, because who can pay internet? But without internet, kids cannot go to school, you know. So the layers, you know, I'm not a social scientist or lawyer like Cassandra, but the layers of oppression, they just increase, because it makes the situation where marginalized people are way more marginalized than before. And we can't travel and we can't go there and they cannot go anywhere. So the land use impact, we're concerned for forests now, because you have people and they're sort of trapped there. The economies are not good. And so, well, what they would do, what I would do, what anybody would do, is just go slash more forests to produce more food, because you need to sustain yourself, because that's the only thing you can do. So we're quite concerned about the global backlash on the forests, you know, on primary resources with negative impact. So I'm sorry to not be very positive. The one maybe part of hope is that there are two things that are really brilliant in Panama and most of the countries that I know. First, they don't ship their old people to old people care. They actually care for their old people. So we remove the old people from our system, we ship them elsewhere. So then we create a massively, highly endangered part of society. Well, in Panama and in Latin America, old people are at home, and so they're less exposed. And the populations are much younger, and they've gone through more diseases and virus and so on. So their immune system is better than ours, so they react better. So the demography and the impact of the virus seems to be better for that. So maybe a lesson we could take from them is we really have to, obviously, is to rethink what we do with our elderly, and looking at what they do elsewhere might be interesting.
Okay, well, there's definitely some optimism and positivity in that answer as well, but very interesting to see how things are reflected differently in different parts of the world. I want to just stick on this topic, but just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions for our panelists, you can send them in by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. Professor Jourdan, let me turn it back to you, because Professor Potvin mentioned marginalized communities, and obviously thinking about Panama and Latin America, but obviously, you know, we have marginalized communities right here in our Western nations, here in Canada and elsewhere. And we've seen how this pandemic has impacted certain socioeconomic groups much harder than others, including those with disabilities and those from racialized communities. And in fact, one report I saw last week suggested that here in Canada, Black Canadians were 3 times more likely than white Canadians to have known someone who's died of the coronavirus. So I guess my questions to you are, you know, do these numbers surprise you? And what should we as a society take away from this experience as we set out to address issues such as climate change and ecological degradation and other sustainability challenges?
Right. So I guess what I will start by saying that I think it's important, a little bit picking up on what Catherine was saying, I think it's important to acknowledge both the vulnerability of certain groups, but also the situations where they might have more resilience than other parts of society. So actually, just on the developing countries thing, I just want to mention that there was a recent survey that was done in around the world, and the question was, how certain are you that vaccines are safe? And in developing countries, the response was 90% of people think that they are safe. And in industrialized countries, only 70% of people think that they are safe, right? So you have this, basically, when a vaccine is rolled out, based on those numbers, I might hypothesize that there'll be more take up in developing countries than industrialized countries. That, of course, is only if the industrialized countries actually don't take up all the doses for themselves. That's a separate issue. But the same thing with masks. We've seen in several developing countries that have more experience with previous pandemics that there's been a take up in terms of everyone using masks. I mean, and South Korea is not a developing country by any means, but I'm struck by the fact that their huge success in controlling the pandemic in the school system is that every student wears a mask. And here in Montreal, I've had conversations with parents who say, "Oh, there's no way an 8-year-old can wear a mask all day." And I just think that's very strange because I have a counter data set of, I don't know, 10 million South Korean children who did this every day. Anyway, but coming back home here, I think we need to think about two things. So one is, for sure, there are certain groups that have underlying vulnerabilities to something like the coronavirus, and that might increase their sensitivity and risks of morbidity and exposure. And so we do see that. I mean, for instance, if you have someone who has a chronic health condition, you are more likely to have complications or die from the pandemic. But I think it's really important to then also look at what are the social and institutional factors that are also underlying this vulnerability, right? So there may be some genetic predisposition amongst persons of color to the virus. That's not clear exactly. We see this in other viruses as well. But certainly, the other thing is there's a high rate of comorbidity with obesity. Okay, so actually in the United States, 70% of persons who are hospitalized for COVID have suffer from obesity. Okay, so why do these communities suffer from obesity? Well, because they live in what are called food deserts, where they don't have access to inexpensive, healthy food, right? So we have to think about all the ways in which society is organized and how that is reflected then in differences between communities. And then similarly, the higher exposure of persons of color is also most likely due to the fact that they're overrepresented in the sort of frontline jobs where you're more exposed to the virus, right? So it's really important to think about, to tie this back to and then for persons with disabilities, it would be a similar thing in terms of thinking about how they are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and therefore, we are not really good in our societies at protecting the most vulnerable, right? And so if we see like the increased rates of mortality in institutional in people who are institutionalized, so whether they are older or have disabilities, right? There's actually been in the United States for 40 years something called the independent living movement, which is about persons with disabilities living at home by themselves, independently, having access to resources and care that allows them to do that. But we have not put that in place by and large still here in Canada, and certainly we've not put in place in many parts of Canada for older people. So the result is they're in these homes that increases their risk to the pandemic. So it's really important to think about the fact that the vulnerability to the pandemic is that ultimately the result of these policy choices and these broader structures that have been put into place for several decades.
Great. Well, thank you. And we could probably have an entire conversation about why a Big Mac trio costs less than a basket of fruit, which I think is one of the issues around, obesity and perhaps morbidity around this particular pandemic. Cassandra, let me turn it over to you. I know that you've touched on earlier about the impact that this is having on women and girls in particular, particularly those from racialized communities. So I guess my question to you is, are there any measures that you think we should be thinking about putting in place to ensure that, when we come out of this pandemic, we're in a better place to serve everybody in a more equitable fashion?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe we can just touch upon like what's happening truly like in so many different sectors of society. And I guess to start off by prefacing that when we recognize that we must first recognize that women exist in a state of social inequality, and that the pandemic fundamentally operates in a way that exacerbates those inequalities. So what we're seeing is highlighting what has already exist and is making it more explicit and worsening those gaps. So for example, like in health, according to the Public Health Agency of Canada, more women have been diagnosed with COVID than men, and more women have died. And this has been correlated a lot with women working in long-term residential centers, which we know have high COVID rates. We know that women work as cleaners, as caregivers, which are often feminized and low-paying forms of labor. We know with Canada's history of colonialism, Indigenous communities, and consequently Indigenous women have less access to safe health infrastructure. They're often overcrowded and declining in services. And we know again with the shadow pandemic that there's been an increase in crisis calls, and that pandemic stressors may worsen gender-based violence. But there are also, considerations that may not be as apparent. For example, like sexual harassment hasn't stopped in the workplace because of pandemic. But if anything, we have less incentive to talk about it now or report about it, which was already taboo, when you need your job to survive in what is about to be, an incredibly horrific recession, if not already started. So in the same vein, like we know in environmental issues, for example, in Canada, Inuit women face the highest rates of food insecurity as a consequence of climate change. They're not able to conduct hunting in the same ways of traditional, food gathering because of the capital intensive, premiums that comes at. So when we're looking at all of these layers and intersections of how gender is gender, race, class, how these divides create, further ramifications for these communities because of the pandemic. We need to recognize that they exist on these systemic levels of, systematically disadvantaging racialized peoples, poor peoples, and they often intersect because of these inequalities and how they are perpetuated within society. So systemic inequality requires systemic reforms. Addressing the pay gap through universal basic income is something that's simple. The government has set a precedent for it, and it's not novel. It's been advocated by grassroots organizations, communities on the ground for decades, if not centuries. There have been the need to engage in the calls to action from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report. It may seem like, what does that have to do with the pandemic? But ending a genocide against Indigenous women can allow for a better status of living to be able to cope with the already horrific consequences of the pandemic in itself. Like, we exist in a state of inequality where people are being disadvantaged for their race, their class, their creed, their socioeconomic status. And then on top of that, we're in a state of pandemic where we're not servicing communities in the way that they deserve to be. Investment in these communities, listening to their needs, needs that they've advocated for decades, is a very baseline starting point to address how to address inequality within the pandemic. I would start there.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thanks for some really good tips in there. So I want to go back to a question which I mentioned in the introduction of this panel earlier. And maybe I'll turn it back to you now, Professor Potvin. That's sort of this issue that we're dealing with. So we're in a pandemic. We've got everybody's kind of come together, and there's really been this collective goodwill, I think, to work together for the most part as a society. And I think a poll I saw last week said 2/3 of Canadians felt that it actually made them feel more connected to their fellow Canadians, to fellow neighbors. On the other hand, people are going to come out of this pandemic really exhausted and stressed and maybe tired of sacrificing for the greater good. And maybe all they're going to want is to get on an airplane and go on some exotic vacation, or go, stock up their wardrobe and make up for lost time. So where do you think society's head or mindset is going to be when we come out of this pandemic, when it comes to now turning our attention to some of the other challenges that we need to face? Are we ready? Is this preparing us for the next big battle on climate change and sustainability? Or is this perhaps going to set us back because people are just going to be so exhausted?
I think it really goes to ingrained value of what we hope for, and and what is good living. If people cannot stop thinking that good living is having this big huge car or this big electric car, I don't think we're going to go anywhere else. So for me, it's a value crisis. I was listening to Cassandra, and I think what this pandemic has done for me anyway, as a climate change scholar, is it exposed so clearly vulnerabilities. And then we have to understand, and I think what it did better than climate change, it is showing us that the safety of every one of us, it depends on the safety of every one of us. We are only safe as everybody else is safe. So if this could then, trickle in people's mind like this, I guess, it would change things, because then when we would think about like how to fight climate change, you would look at Montreal and you would say, where are the neighborhoods that were hardest hit? Montréal Nord, Parc Extension. These are the poor neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are deprived of parks. They're deprived of bike lanes. They're deprived of common space. They're deprived of roadblocks where people could meet. It's amazing. Just go visit our city now. The rich neighborhood have all these streets that have been blocked with cafes and things. The poor neighborhoods have even been deprived of that. The corridors for safe walking are not existing in the most densely populated neighborhood of our own cities. So we need to elevate this and think that with climate change, it's going to be the same in our cities, in our provinces, in our countries, and internationally. With climate change, we need to understand the vulnerabilities will be heightened. If there's a forest fire near your home or a flood, your ability to have the resilience depends on your wealth. But then the poor people that will be unable to have resilience, they will try to migrate and they will want to come here. So there's no safety in this planet unless we understand the connectivity. And I don't think there's a response to climate change. So my only hope is that with COVID, people click on this simple message. The safety of all of us is the safety of all of us. And if it managed to do this, then maybe there's hope. But if everybody goes back into their self-goodness, my self-wealth, myself looking at myself, will never go anywhere. So that, I guess that's my hope. It's my hope that, the self-care thing, I'm not a social scientist. I find that's very scary, because for me, self-care is caring for others as well as me. And so if the getting out of pandemic is let's now do everything we could not do, it's going to be a disaster.
Okay. But let me, I want to stick with, just add to that with you, Professor Potvin, because when we spoke, you a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned a couple of things that really stood out for me that I want to sort of bring to this conversation. Now, you said, one is you said there's no vaccine for climate change. And the second thing that really stood out for me, you said that when it comes to climate change and the environment, the oil lobby is just too powerful. That I guess what you're suggesting is with the pandemic, there's a sense that we're all kind of on the same side of all this. So can I ask you maybe just to expand a little bit on those 2 points about there not really being an easy solution to climate change? And
no, there's not, because, Sébastien was talking about the benefit of work from, teleworking, working from away, which might be true, but there might be some feminine problem there. A woman is stuck at home with the kids anyway. But just from an environmental viewpoint, it could also mean that everybody now starts to live elsewhere than in the big cities, with a huge spillover land use effect on forest and wild spaces, because then everybody wants to work from their home, and they will move their home to a lake, to a cottage, to a mountain, to a park. And so, instead of densifying herbs, it will spread people all over. So there's no vaccine. It's you can see it with the pandemic. People had an easier time reacting to the imminent closure in March than now. People are a bit worn out. It's only been 6 months. With climate change, we're talking 20 years to solve the problem. It's a huge challenge to get people mobilized for such a long-term response. And I think that's where Sweden versus the world had a different vision. Sweden said, this thing is going to last. We're going to take measures, that people can withstand. Most other countries, we said, we don't know, let's shut down everything. Well, you cannot shut down everything for 20 years. So climate change is going to be like a movement, to get there. And of course, this movement should displace economic sector. In the pandemic, we're seeing big problems in the economic sector that are related to arts, performance, music, theater, opera, and also restaurants and so on. Well, with climate change, it's the oil related activities that need to be displaced. That's it. There's no other solution. There's no other solution. We need to move away from an oil-based energy system to a renewable, low-carbon energy system. So these are rich industry, and I don't know, but I believe they probably talk to powers more than other groups of society. I mean, you and I, we don't invite prime minister on our yacht because we don't have a yacht and the prime minister doesn't talk to us. But rich people have yachts and talk to prime ministers. And so there's an inequity. It's, I grew up in kind of more Catholic Quebec, and we had David and Goliath, unfair fighting. So I think it's a bit one of the roadblock for a sustainability transition in Canada.
So let me turn it back to Cassandra as the sort of student, young person on the panel. Do you feel that your generation of students and peers are maybe approaching this with a different mindset? Might we see in a few years when the next generation takes the levers of power that there is going to be a different, a more serious approach to climate change and sustainability issues?
Yeah. So the issue with this is that the onus is continuously placed on young people to fix the errors of generations before them who have placed profits over people, as Professor Potvin, eloquently stated. We learned of climate change in 1850 by Eunice Foote, who was an American scientist and a woman, whose discovery of global warming had to be presented by men to be taken seriously. And generations before, we have known for centuries the dangers and have refused to act. Young people are leaving their classes for climate strikes when they should be getting an education to protest their right to life. We're marching. Last year, I had the privilege of sitting on a panel with teenagers who are suing the Canadian government for violating their fundamental rights because of the Canadian government's contributions to global warming and the lack of a comprehensive climate action plan. As a law student and someone who's had cases in the judicial system, interacting with the courts is demanding, exhausting, burdensome, it's intimate. And the fact that these young people, 16, 17-year-olds, are taking on the government is I mean, it's awe-inspiring, but it's definitely a lot to ask of them. And this burden shouldn't be on young people to fix things to begin with. And nonetheless, they employ their agency to make a difference, to look at climate change effects and ask people in power to care about their lives and their futures. Because currently, like, I'm part of Gen Z and I'm not sure I have one. But nonetheless, like, we've manufactured these levers of power that adults assume that we have to wait for once we get an education or that sort of thing. But we've engaged in our own agency. We've engaged in collectivism, which has been a huge trend during the pandemic, which we need to address and respect, because for a long period of time, Western liberal democracies have told us that centralized governments are the way to make decisions to govern the lives of most people, and have used that to often, through the tyranny of the majority, to disadvantage, marginalized folks and marginalize them actively. Young people, people of color, people across social strata have come together in mutual aid networks, have come together to address climate change, have come together to rally, to protest. I think young people are very much already doing a lot. And the mindset or disposition is not necessarily needed to be achieved when, our generation's lives are on the line. So there's still definitely dissent, but there's a lot of collective action fighting for our rights and lives. And I will say, as a caveat, collectivism very much is something that is not rooted in, Western liberal democratic thought. It's very much rooted in Eastern communities, which again, like we've seen in different countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, where collectivist action has really created a lot of social coordination. We've seen that in Indigenous communities here who have been disadvantaged and also been told that their traditions are primitive. We've seen that that's been essential for our survival during the pandemic. Like, this is a moment for our country to really reflect on how we have used the upper hand to disadvantage people, but also, question their epistemologies and ontologies when they've truly served as an essential tool. And it's young people right now who are truly, pushing forward those waves of change.
Okay, great. Thank you. Professor Jourdain, so I do want to maybe turn the topic a little bit, and just another piece we mentioned at the beginning was sort of the research community. And maybe I can ask you from an academic perspective. And we have seen just tremendous collaborations taking shape among researchers, among academics, across disciplines, across regions. A lot of it has really been focused on vaccine development and treatments and the sort of medical and scientific fields, but also, sociologists and legal experts such as yourself. Have you been surprised, or perhaps maybe better words, encouraged by some of the collaborations that have taken shape under these extenuating or extreme circumstances? And is that something we maybe can turn to for hope as we look to solve some of these other issues?
Yes, well, I mean, I think both the Canadian and Quebec governments were really proactive in the different research funding bodies rolling out emergency sort of grant programs focused on COVID-19. I and some colleagues in the Faculty of Medicine, we've won a few of these now, and we're working on disability rights and the pandemic. So they were really very quick, actually, in sort of prioritizing research, not just medical research, but also looking at the social science side of things. And you're right, we are seeing globally unprecedented levels of collaboration between scientists. However, the biggest problem are governments and the sort of global politics. So we have seen we've seen, first of all, some countries adopting what's called a vaccine nationalist approach. Prioritizing certain doses or certain types of vaccines over others to reserve that for their own citizens. But we've also seen, for instance, different governments competing with one another to actually prioritize access or remove access to data. So there was a Canadian vaccine that was supposed to go ahead with tests in China, and then a few weeks ago, their partners in China said, no, we're not doing this anymore, and it is most likely tied to the ongoing tensions between China and Canada. So unfortunately, we are seeing lots of collaboration between scientists, but the collaboration between governments has not been at the same level. But again, it will be interesting to see if we can build on this type of collaboration and some of the innovative open access practices that have been developed after the pandemic is over.
Great, thank you. So we do have one question that came in from one of our viewers ahead of this webcast, which I think I'm going to turn to you, Professor Potvin. Again, as the scientist biologist on the panel. Perhaps you can answer this one. It came from Elizabeth Robinson, a McGill Medicine graduate, class of 1972. So thank you for taking the time to send this in. So she was interested to hear comments on the ideas of limits to growth. A lot of people are saying that we cannot continue to have growth on a finite planet. Will we be able to limit growth in a way that is fair to the 7.7 billion inhabitants of the planet? And what will this look like?
So there's been a sort of an equation that I think can capture, that's been proposed to capture this planetary limit, which is basically saying that the impact on the environment is a function of the population numbers, how many humans there are, the technologies that they're using. I mean, there are some technologies that have much more negative impact on the environment than others, and then consumption pattern. So the limit to growth of the planet is a function of those three things. So you could have more people on the planet if technologies are more benign, and if everybody, take less intense, part of the natural resources. And there's been international attempts at the same time as this big environmental conference, the Rio Summit in 1992, that began, the Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Biodiversity. Shortly thereafter, there's been several attempts to have a convention on demography. And that has been the single most difficult topic. Countries, people in general, don't want to be told how many children will you have, and hence how rapidly will the population of the planet increase. And China is, in a sense, the only country in the world that has been able to implement for the long term a natality control policy. So the population aspect of the limit to the planet is extremely difficult to tackle. So then I would say the bulk of the effort have been into the technology development. I call that sometimes the techno fix, thinking that if we remove all our fuel car by electric car, we'll solve climate change, which is not going to work, because even making a car is just too much. And so then, there are the others that advocate the consumption pattern, which is the what I was referring to when I was talking maybe about the self-care and what do we need to be happy. And I think this is probably the most difficult element of this planetary limit, is to realize you don't need so much to be happy. Yes, there is certainly a part of increased economy that tremendously improve welfare. So well-being, I should say, not welfare, sorry for the English slip. So if you're very poor and you cannot sustain yourself and you're going to sleep at night not knowing if you can feed your kids next day, this is very difficult. And so having more access to an economy, which is this basic income, it really helps your quality of life. But then after, there is so much fluff and surplus. I would think that the hope for maintaining the planet within its living boundary, it really comes not just from the techno fix, but also from tackling the consumption pattern and hence the value of people and their sense of well-being, being less attached to the accumulation of material goods.
Great. Well, great answer.
Derek,
Thank you.
I was hoping I could chime in here for just a quick second.
Sure. We have about 30 seconds left, I think.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to quickly say that it is, when we do talk about limiting population growth and things like that, it is quite neoliberal to see individual growth and the right to life as the inhibitor to sustainability, when it is often, corporations that contribute a majority of destructive practices to the environment. And it's very Western. There are many ways to, support reproductive rights. And a lot of indigenous traditional knowledge systems that tell us that we don't have to be at odds with the environment. We can be stewards and support it as well. So that's just something to quickly add in a socio-legal, socio-cultural analysis of it.
Right. No, that's a very good point. I'm glad that you brought that up. And this was, those of you who tuned in 2 weeks ago, this was also a big topic of the conversation as well. And this whole issue of our consumption and really defining what is a need versus a want and how much we really think that's going to be a recurring theme as we work through these webcasts the next few weeks. So I do notice that we are just about out of time for our session today. But before we close, I would like to remind you that this video will be available at the same link after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. If you're a McGill graduate not receiving our emails but would like to be added to our distribution list, you can visit alumni.mcgill.ca/register to sign up. And this link will also be available beneath the video player on our YouTube channel. I would, of course, before we end, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our three guests, and what incredible conversation we had today with Professors Catherine Potvin and Sébastien Jaudoin, as well as Cassandra Naranjan, for joining us and sharing their views around some very difficult, but I think very important questions. The conversation will continue in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, October 1st, when I will be joined by McGill professors from the departments of chemistry and geography to explore the question of why sustainability research has become so challenging, and why you might want to think twice the next time you throw away the shells from your favorite shrimp dish. So I hope to see you back here for that conversation. Until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Born from a will, made here by dreamers and risk takers, by makers and big thinkers. Through trial and error, we face what's ahead, staying true to the voice that never fails us. Keep learning. We were made for this. Made by lamplight and late nights, by salut and goodbyes, by questioning everything and feeding our curiosity, by testing our resilience, by finding our limits. By pushing forward and by breaking through, by finding a new way, our own way. We're made where ideas are built and built upon, where we come together and we rise above. We are made by McGill.